Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. We're in the middle of a series of episodes discussing Christian nationalism, offering a variety of perspectives. In this episode, we interview Professor James Walters, an Anglican priest who teaches at the London School of Economics. He offers a perspective we have not yet heard on this podcast, coming from a member of an established state church in Europe. Professor Walters distinguishes between nationalism and patriotism, and argues that Christians can and should strive to be patriotic. This was a fascinating episode, full of insights about how and why Christians can uphold pluralism while also contending for the influence of the church on national politics. I hope you enjoy listening. Professor James Walters, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
It's my pleasure.
So we're in the middle of a series on Christian nationalism, and we'd like to start with getting our terms right. Christian nationalism seems to mean different things for different people.
Yeah, sure.
So what would you understand? First of all, what is nationalism?
So clearly, nationalism has got something to do with the assertion of the superiority of your nation over other nations. But I think I've been thinking a little bit about what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism. And I think of myself as quite a patriotic person. I kind of like being British and English. That's a complicated relationship as well.
Indeed.
There's things I'm proud of about my country and things that I think are kind of really good about it. So what stops me being a nationalist? And I think the distinction is that nationalism really asserts not just the superiority of your nation, but the superiority of its citizens, or at least what are perceived to be the true citizens of your nation, over other humans. So we are better because we belong to this national community. I think patriotism is something much more aspirational. It's saying, if I live up to the ideals that this national community represents, then I will be a better human. I'm not inherently better, but there are some ideals here. And so if you think, well, as you'll know, Barney, I don't know about you, Austin, that we have this national hymn, Jerusalem, which was written by William Blake, who's definitely someone who couldn't really be described as a nationalist. But it's often sung now at kind of national events and could be used in a sort of a slightly jingoistic way. But I don't think it will be considered an expression of Christian nationalism.
For the uninitiated, who might be wondering why England has a national anthem that's titled Jerusalem, which is a city that's not in England. It's William Blake asking whether Jesus ever set foot in England, basically.
Exactly. And he knows that he probably didn't. But it's asking, can we conceive of our nation as one blessed by God, one in which we see the incarnation being worked out around us among these dark satanic mills, which didn't exist in the first century. So he's considering it now. And it's called Jerusalem because Jerusalem is always the symbol of the aspiration to the city of God, the holy city. And so in the second verse, it's all about, bring me my bow of burning gold. I will not cease from burning fire. I will not cease from mental fight until we have built Jerusalem. It's an aspiration. It's a challenge to play your role in bringing about the kingdom of God in the setting that you're in. It's not about saying we're inherently better because we come from this country.
Okay, so there's a difference there between assuming that you just by your nature are superior versus feeling a calling to live up to some sort of an ideal that your nation is setting before you?
I think so. And that's why, and some people are very nervous about patriotism as well, but I don't think it's inherently a bad thing. I think human beings operate at different scales, and the scale of the nation is a sort of important one. And one of the reasons, I think, why we are seeing a rise in nationalism, including religious forms of nationalism, and particularly in Western Europe, is that politicians have played down the notion that people need to have a rich understanding of their community of belonging, that is the nation.
Their identity, as it were.
Yeah, I think identity works on different levels, and national identity is an important aspect of it. I think it's also important, part of my understanding of how a good nation state should work is that it is, to use a phrase from the English pluralist tradition, a community of communities. So you have to have your sense of belonging to the national community, but that national community itself is richly diverse, which is why we get into trouble if we associate the nation with one religion exclusively. exclusively.
Yeah, one of the things
Yes.
that I think is challenging about these ideas of patriotism and nationalism is that you also maybe a healthy patriotism has a vision of the nation wherein these different subgroups have a place. And
Yeah.
often nationalism is about saying only one of these subgroups actually has a place. And it's about sort of fighting over against these other people in the nation, right? And saying actually this is the only true. And sometimes I think that's where even patriotism becomes problematic. This is the ideal, and you need to stop being like, this whole range of people that live in our country in order to live up to this ideal. I wonder if that's part of the challenge with both of these concepts.
Yes, and I think included in those ideals needs to be something about plurality and openness to difference and learning from new people who arrive, so it can't be a kind of ossified or nostalgic notion of what the nation is. But that can be part of the tradition too. I mean, I think it has been in the UK and certainly in America, a sense of kind of the pride in the growing diversity and how you engage with that.
So you're saying, you talked about the rise in Christian nationalism in Western Europe, and you basically said it could be seen as a reaction against a forgetfulness that people need to belong to some sort of communal identity. What do you think is the cause of that forgetfulness? Then why have people forgotten that need of an individual to belong to something larger?
Well, first of all, I would say it's a response to a number of things. So it's not just that one thing. Obviously, immigration is a big driver, and it's forcing a lot of issues about identity. And it's also forcing these questions about, in many cases, the arrival of new populations who seem to know quite well who they are and what they're about. So it kind of forces the question on us, well, who are we and what are we about? And I think if we did have a richer self-understanding, we would be less anxious about immigration, because we feel less threatened by communities that seem to have a very thick culture. But why have we got to that point of forgetfulness? This is complex and a long history, but it seems to me that through the modern era, we've come to think that the state is built on some fairly functional building blocks of democratic participation and the rule of law and the operation of the free market and all these kinds of things, which, is not wrong. But we've neglected the stories that inform the nation state as well, I think. And particularly in Europe, we've gone through a phase of embarrassment, I would say, about Christian heritage. And so I think, for example, I remember in 2004, when the European Union was receiving new accession states from Eastern Europe, and there was an attempt to write a preamble to the European Constitution, trying to tell something of the story of Europe. And the Poles, who were one of the accession countries, were very keen for Christianity to feature in the course of this. The French, of course, and other nations, far more resistant, and really seemed to be very comfortable in grounding the origins of European democracy and the European project in the ancient world and Athens, but ignoring the fact that for over 1,000 years, this was really the center of Christianity.
So it's how you tell the story of Europe. There was conflict over whether you emphasize the sort of Christian origins of a lot of European identity, or whether you skip over that to just go to the sort of Greek and Roman origin.
That's right. And I remember reading a comment piece on this that said it's as if no one of significance lived between Marcus Aurelius and Voltaire. Like, all these great Christian contributors to European heritage, of whom St. Benedict, for example, seems to me absolutely indispensable in the formation of European institutions and culture and life, just ignored. So I think this has been a real blind spot. And this is what some of the populist far-right political leaders are tapping into in Europe, a sense that our heritage has been suppressed and is now vulnerable to particularly Islam as a kind of more confident civilization coming in, imposing its values and threatening our own.
Yeah, so that's part of the point of why I guess there was resistance to including Christianity in the story of Europe, right? To go back to the point you made earlier about the dangers of associating national identity with a particular religion, which makes people who don't belong to that religion but do belong to that nation feel like second-class citizens or like slightly uncomfortable, I guess. And that was the origin of that resistance, I guess.
Exactly. And sort of treaties of Westphalia view that the way in which we create stable societies is by essentially privatizing religion, which of course wasn't exactly what happened at the end of the Wars of Religion, but it's kind of that's the mythology that emerged. I know you've had Bill Kavanagh on this podcast, and he really kind of tells this story very well, I think. And so we still have this very strong sense that religion is dangerous when it's in the public sphere, and so it's best not to talk about it. But now what we're encountering is non-European cultures where not only is that not the culture, but it's kind of not really the nature of the religion itself. And so Europeans are having to realize that we've got to have much more difficult conversations about religion in the public sphere. And also just be a bit more honest about how Christianity has formed us. I mean, we have Christmas holidays and Easter holidays when you don't have to work. That's not a secular decision. That's part of the heritage that's been received. And Tom Holland, the historian, and others have done a bit of work recently.
Well, I guess there's two different points there. Like there's the question of whether Christianity played an important role in Europe's historical identity, which is sort of, I think that's hard to question, right? Like Christianity, as a matter of historical fact, was the dominant force in European society for hundreds of years. But related to that is the question, how much do we want to hold on to that now? How much do we still want to have Christmas and Easter as holidays without adding some of the holidays from other religions, for example?
And the complex question of, maybe the opposite side of what some Christian nationalists are doing, from a Christian side wanting to say, well, in many ways, since the foundation of modern nation states, it's largely been secularized versions of Christian ideas that have formed and shaped these communities. I mean, obviously, these are really complex genealogies, right? But how much is any of this actually Christian, or has this been a fundamentally secular project from the beginning? But I think the point that you make about Christianity, in many ways, and especially in Europe, it's a Christianity that's willing to play ball as a kind of privatized belief within a kind of broader secular society that people are comfortable with. And I think it's interesting because part of what Christian nationalists are doing is saying, let's not have Christianity be that anymore, right? Let's have Christianity instead be the kind of ruling force in politics, the same way that they see Islam doing in kind of Muslim countries. Do you think, is that fair to say?
I think some forms of, yes. I think that's more what Christian nationalists are saying in the United States. I don't hear many right-wing politicians in Europe really talking about the imposition of some sort of Christian government. I think they're trying more to harness a sense that a Judeo-Christian heritage is under threat. I mean, I think I should also say that what's happened in UK and specifically in England through the modern era is something really quite different. I mean, we have this paradox of a great deal of secularism, by which I mean religion playing less and less of a meaningful role in most people's lives, but at the same time, an extraordinary public level of public recognition of a national church. And, you only had to watch the coronation of Charles III and, to see this is country in which Christianity is still very present, albeit with declining congregations.
Yeah, it was really striking for me as an American when I moved to England, even just having all these colleagues that were not Christians but knew all the words to all the hymns at like a Christmas service or that kind of thing. I was like, wow, this is really interesting.
Right. Yeah, and so you see, I'm interested in this because I think the instinct when we see Christian nationalism or other religious nationalisms, this is happening across all the world religions, is to ask the question, well, how do we put religion back in its box? How do we get back to a kind of secular neutrality within the public sphere? And I think that ship has sailed. I think we are in a post-secular era where religion is going to be more present in the political and geopolitical spheres than it was at least perceived to be by Western elites through the modern era. So the question then becomes, well, what kind of religion do we want present in the public?
I think that's the key question, isn't it? It's because I don't think anybody who is actually a Christian really wants the government to be completely secular. And, most of the people we've had on this podcast so far are quite strongly opposed to Christian nationalism. We're trying to get a few more voices on who are slightly more sympathetic to it to balance it out. But this opposition, I do find myself ending up asking, well, what do you want instead? What are we aiming for as Christians? And very often it seems like the answer is complete withdrawal from all politics.
Right. So I'm not quite going to defend Christian nationalism, but I don't want that extreme either. So I've rejected Christian nationalism. Maybe I can do something with my Christian patriotism, or at least patriotism in a country that I would describe as post-Christian. And post-Christian in the sense of, just as the modern is still present in postmodern, there is still Christian present in post-Christian. We still have this kind of sort of structure. And I think one of the strengths of the Church of England and the religious settlement in England is that you have a national church that over the course of history has evolved through various toleration acts of Roman Catholics, dissenters, helping to assist in the most part inclusion of Jewish citizens and others, evolving into the kind of national church that, as was described by the late Queen and now continued by King Charles, is a sort of umbrella for religious expression and a holder of kind of religious freedom and the right to religious expression within the country. And that's manifest in quite practical ways. I mean, certainly over the last couple of years, in terms of the holding of interreligious conversations since 7th of October and the Guards of War, the Church of England has been playing a really important role in that, trying to strengthen community relations. The King has been very active in relation to that. So I don't want to see Christianity imposed on the nation through the government, but I believe in the role that the church can play in relation to government, and particularly the sort of unusual relationship that the church has with the head of state in this country in fostering religious freedom and religious life in the country.
That is very interesting, actually, because I'm British, although I live in America right now, so my interests are sort of divided, and I've been spending a lot more of my time thinking about the situation in America, and most of our guests so far have been American guests thinking about American Christian nationalism. But what you're presenting is something that's quite different, that's never had that separation of church and state that America is proud of. And now you're actually saying we don't necessarily want a full separation of church and state anyway.
So, I mean, and even from my perspective, some of the debates that are very shrill in the United States, like about putting the Ten Commandments in classrooms, for example, well, I don't see that as necessarily hugely problematic. The problem is why that is done and who that is attempting to include and exclude. But within this country, the Church of England is the largest single provider of schools in the country. And those schools will have a cross in every classroom and have certain aspects of Christian ethos. But at the same time, they are hugely popular with non-Christian families and including families of other faiths. And I'm the governor of a Church of England school that has about 50% Muslim families, and they love it. And, they want to get their children into the church school rather than the community school where they feel that Christian values where religious values aren't going to be upheld. And actually, with kind of the nature of Islam, I can kind of imagine some of our parents saying, yeah, let's have the Ten Commandments in the classroom.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's very politically charged, some of these questions, aren't they? It's not just what is happening, as you say, but it's why it's happening and who it's meant to attack. And you're right that in many ways, Islam and Christianity have a lot of common cause in contrast to secularism. I have friends in Norway, for example, who say that all of the Muslims in Norway want to send their children to Christian schools because they'd rather have their children in Christian schools than in a sort of secular school.
Yeah, right. And the same here. So I can't, I mean, I'm a priest in an established church. So I don't believe in a total separation of church and state. I can't. But I think what's crucially important is a differentiation of church and state and an appropriate relation between the two. Theologically, an appropriate differentiation between the state as a dimension of the world, the kingdom of God, and the church that is kind of our vehicle between the two. And I think that kind of working out all these theological concepts as a way of making sense of kind of what we practically want to see is really crucially important.
Yeah, one of the questions this raises, and as you guys mentioned, is, well, like, which what kind of religion is being established, right? One of the things about the Church of England, when it's playing that role well, is that it's a form of Christianity that is really kind of warm and open to religious pluralism, right? These are Christians who see kind of religion as a good thing, even if it's a different religion, or at least want to, be in kind of dialogue and hold space for that. Whereas if it was, the difference in the US, right, is most of the people trying to put the Ten Commandments in schools are really extreme Pentecostal evangelicals who say no one else is Christians but the people who do just what we do. All other religions are demonic, and that form of religion to then be established would not play the same role in public, right?
Right. I'm not advocating for an immediate adoption of the model in this context, but in terms of thinking about that evolution. And I think crucial to all of this, and what I've got very interested in, not just in the context of the country in which I live, but in other countries around the world, is what is the container for religious pluralism, and how can that container, or how can that form of religious pluralism be something that all religious groups recognize as in their interest? And I think one of the important pieces of work that has been done in many places is to get people from a sense that religious difference is a threat to my theology and my faith, it must be eradicated, to a point of saying, well, religious pluralism is just simply a fact. It's a fact of the world. It's a fact of the societies that we live in, and increasingly so because of migration and all these other factors and the digital world. So seeking to eradicate that is something very dark and terrifying. We have to find a way of engaging well with it in a way that doesn't compromise our beliefs. And that includes the ability to evangelize and to say why we think our religion is superior to other religions, and have those kinds of respectful but honest conversations. But you can only get to that point if you just recognize the fact of this plurality and the importance of religious freedom, which has always been very important in America. And I think it's rather frightening that it's under threat now.
The importance of religious freedom, certainly, it seems to be one of the things that's getting sidelined by the variety of Christian nationalism we're seeing in some places. But I think a lot of it comes down to the question of when religion takes on coercive features or uses the government to engage in certain coercions in its own favour. That's when people start to raise red flags and say, this is not the kind of religious nationalism that we want. But on the other hand, you could ask, well, what else does the government do? It needs to coerce to a certain extent to ensure cohesion and rule of law and all those kinds of things. And what else do you want the rule of law to be based on if not Christian values?
So within the Church of England context, a lot of our thinking about political theology has been hugely shaped in the 20th century by Archbishop William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury during the Second World War and wrote a book called Church and Christianity and Social Order, which has really influenced a lot of this thinking. And he said something that I always find quite helpful to think of in this context, which is that as Christians, we should be wanting to live in societies where all crimes are sins, but not all sins are crimes. And it's quite a good lens to look at politics through, because first of all, we need to have a red flag when we perceive that things are being criminalized that we don't think are sinful. Is it a sin to seek asylum if you're fleeing persecution or destitution? Is it a sin to protest against the destruction of the planet if you think that it's going to kind of destroy civilization in the way that many do? These things, once they become crimes, as Christians, we need to be concerned about things. And that's a kind of different lens for looking at Christianity and politics. But then the second part of it, not all sins should be crimes, I think is also another really important element. And part of the humility that Christianity needs to have in living in more plural societies, but also the humility that the church needs to have in living in a world that is fallen and in which God has given people free will. And so there will be things. And so there are things that are legal in the UK that I think are really morally wrong. And we need to have good conversations about why we think that's morally wrong. But it's the task of the church to communicate that as a public good, rather than to kind of lobby Parliament or use government to deprive people of freedoms for what we think is right. We have to make the case.
So all crimes are sins, or all crimes should be crimes because they are considered sinful. but not all sins are crimes. That's much more helpful than the strapline I've often heard in other contexts, which just says that it's not the role of the government to legislate morality. Because whenever I've heard that, I've always thought, well, what else is the government supposed to do? Legislating morality is like saying, like, if you steal, you'll get put in prison. Everybody wants that, but it doesn't make that distinction that you've made there, which I think is really helpful.
It lies into quite a kind of problematic personal view of morality. Again, that's sort of part of this privatization of religion and the self. And
Yes, indeed. But then I guess that the real difficulty comes in distinguishing between those sins which we think should count as crimes and those sins which we think shouldn't count as crimes, which is where getting into the weeds of that is where things get a bit complicated.
And is that mostly just, would you say, in a pluralistic context, if we're the only ones who think it's a sin and no one else does, then it's not a crime? Is that kind of how you would think about it?
I suppose that's right. Particularly with and obviously, the very live issues are euthanasia and abortion and these kinds of questions. I think we have to face the reality that there's very stark disagreement, and we really have to make the case. And I'm quite sort of Rawlsian on this, the philosopher who said that, that religious people kind of need to communicate in a language that is accessible to non-believers within the public sphere. And, so in my childhood, I remember, one of these kind of topics was Sunday trading, and should shops be open on Sundays? And
I remember that discussion as well.
Right, yeah.
A lot of Christians got up in arms. They're like, no, we should not have shops open on Sundays.
That's right. And I think the problem in that conversation was that a lot of Christians just sounded like kind of killjoys or kind of very pietistic, sort of saying, no, we should all be in church or kind of sitting at home. And, those sort of brethren communities where swings are padlocked in children's playgrounds on Sundays.
Gosh.
But actually it seemed to me that, do we want to live in a society where people, particularly low-wage workers, are kind of just living kind of completely unregulated labor experiences where they're having to work on Sundays and they can't spend time with their families, or shifts don't coincide, so that they're not seeing their children? Like, I think we have to make those kind of wider arguments.
Yeah, and that's where, that's a perfect example where, the Christians really could have been in common cause with the socialists, except that they, in certain contexts, see themselves as enemies. But it's like, that was a strong capitalist takeover of English culture to say, let's have everybody work all the time.
Absolutely. I think in fairness there was. Keep Sunday Special worked with the unions, on this. Pretty much lost. You still have to remember to get to the supermarket before 5 p.m. on a Sunday.
That's right. Yeah. Unlike in the US where everything's pretty much 24 hours. I think this is really, really helpful to think about the context in the UK. And a lot of Americans do look to the UK, for a lot of these kinds of things, but I think that they rarely understand what's happening there.
A very particular history, as I say, and I don't think it's an easy replicable culture, but it's all part of what's interesting me at the moment, which is to say, how can we have a majority religion that is generous and hospitable and making space for other faiths? Because, and I think this is important framing for this conversation, is, Christian nationalism isn't happening in isolation. We're seeing Hindu nationalism in India. We're seeing a far stronger Jewish identity of the State of Israel than has ever been the case in religious terms. And so kind of trying to turn the clock back, if it was ever the case, to some kind of secular state that subordinates religion to a secondary category is very unlikely. So we need models of religion within the public sphere that is not discriminatory, that isn't about subordinating everybody else to what we think, but that's enabling conversations. And in the work that I do internationally, I really think that a crucial part of this is to have very strong civil society institutions and strong civil society engagement across religious groups. And I get more and more nervous about government taking too strong a role, in any of this stuff. I think religions need to ensure governments need to ensure religious freedom and then enable faith communities to work things out within their society.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think we see a lot, and including in the US, right, is the increasingly faith communities feel disenfranchised from what's happening in government, but also just maybe aren't engaged, right? And so they're not working with the other, religious communities in their city, to sort of seek the common good together, but rather just arguing. We've talked about this a few times, right? Everybody's arguing just at a national level about what things should look like, and they don't even know their neighbors or the communities around them.
Right, and at a global level, because the social media platforms, which are built on a business model of polarization and anger, are shaping the discourse. And so, more and more, I just think back to the local, back to the face-to-face. As a church community, make friends with the mosque, meet these people, talk to them, talk about what matters to you, talk about parking, talk about, the issues that children in the community are facing, work together. We've really, really got to renew civil society in the face of governments that are either ineffective or more sinister.
I think it all comes down to something you said, which is about how we can have a model for religious pluralism that looks forward rather than back, because I don't think anybody who's religious really wants secularism to be the umbrella or the framework in which all the religions have to sort of conform, because secularism isn't neutral. We don't have a neutral space. So what can we do going forward to make sure that everybody has a say, all the different religious participants have a say in the way government is run, in a way that both preserves religious freedom and yet provides a sort of thick sense of national identity for people who want to have a sense of belonging to this wider thing.
The thing that secularism did really well was present itself as the neutral option. And one of the challenges that I think Christianity faces is if it wants to play a role in politics, I think it does need to prove itself capable of preserving and supporting religious pluralism, right? And it hasn't always done that, and which is why people, I think, are wary of that, and especially in contexts where it's not remotely trying to do that now, like the US, but the need for, a sort of robust theological vision for religious pluralism, if Christians are going to play a role in the state, seems I think really essential at this moment.
That's what I didn't say very well earlier, is that the Church of England has learned this the hard way. We have burned people alive. I hope I don't paint a rosy picture of the tradition of my church. It's been very, very brutal, and partly sort of emerging out of that history that we come to this new place of humility.
Yeah, totally. That's what we're looking for, really. We're looking for a form of Christian involvement in politics which actually seeks to uphold pluralism. But we don't have very many examples from history to point to help us with that.
No, and I mean, people talk about the sort of golden age in Damascus or Valencia, the southern Spain, but I don't know that we really know enough about these societies. I don't know. But clearly these societies were more plural than they are now. And certainly not less religious.
Right.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. And that really, I think, highlights for us that at the center of this is really a theological challenge, thinking about what forms of Christianity are prominent in these conversations. What's the theology behind this? And in countries where Christianity means 1,000 different things, I think in the US, this is why especially it's very difficult for Christianity to have a legitimate voice, because usually the point is grab some political power so you can shut down the other Christian voices, rather than a sort of unified and open place to speak on behalf of Christians.
Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.